the winter of 1881, authorities in Leadville, Colorado, discovered something that would haunt the mining camps of the Rocky Mountains for decades to come. Beneath the floorboards of the McKenna sisters' saloon, investigators found 23 sets of women's clothing, carefully folded and stored like inventory in a warehouse. Each bundle contained a handwritten note with a name, an age, a physical description, and most chilling of all, a price. What made this discovery even more disturbing was that not a single one of these women had been seen in Leadville for months. Yet their belongings remained, catalogued with the cold precision of a business ledger tracking livestock sales. The items themselves told stories of interrupted lives. A blue calico dress that still smelled faintly of lavender soap, a pair of worn leather boots with careful repairs that spoke of poverty and pride, a silver locket containing the photograph of an elderly woman who would never know what had happened to her daughter. Among the more heartbreaking discoveries were letters addressed to families back east, never sent, describing hopes for new lives in the West and promises to write again soon with news of success. The McKenna sisters, Catherine and Margaret, had vanished 3 days before the raid, leaving behind only these silent testimonies to crimes that local authorities would spend years trying to fully understand. Their disappearance had been so complete that neighbors claimed they had simply gone to bed one evening as respected business owners and awakened to find their building empty, as if the sisters had been swallowed by the mountain air itself. Before we continue with the story of the McKenna sisters and the dark truth behind their profitable establishment, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts across the country. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light. The investigation that followed would reveal a network of human trafficking that stretched from the Colorado mining camps to the brothels of San Francisco, a conspiracy so methodically organized that it challenged everything the frontier town thought it knew about the two Irish women who had seemed like nothing more than hard-working business owners trying to make their way in the rough world of the American West. What they uncovered would prove that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones who smile at you over a cup of coffee and ask about your family back home. Leadville, Colorado, in 1881 was a city drunk on silver and gold, where fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a pickaxe, and where desperate souls from across the country converged in search of prosperity that seemed to glitter in every stream and rocky outcrop. Perched at over 10,000 feet above sea level in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, the town had exploded from a few hundred residents to nearly 30,000 in just 3 years, making it the second largest city in Colorado after Denver and one of the most chaotic boom towns in American history. The transformation had been remarkable and violent. What had once been a quiet valley where Ute Indians hunted elk and gathered medicinal plants had become a maze of wooden buildings, muddy streets, and the constant thunder of mining equipment. The Matchless Mine, the Little Pittsburgh, and dozens of other claims were pulling millions of dollars worth of silver ore from the mountains, creating instant millionaires and attracting every type of fortune seeker imaginable. The air itself seemed to vibrate with ambition and desperation, thick with the smoke of smelters and the dreams of men who believed the next shovel of dirt might change their lives forever. The streets ran thick with mud in summer and were buried under snow for half the year. But the promise of precious metals kept the saloons, gambling halls, and businesses running 24 hours a day. Harrison Avenue, the town's main thoroughfare, was lined with establishments that catered to every human need and vice. The Tabor Opera House, where famous performers came to entertain the newly wealthy gambling parlors, where fortunes changed hands over poker games that lasted for days, and dozens of saloons where miners spent their earnings as fast as they could dig them from the ground. The boom had attracted every type of person imaginable. Seasoned miners with calloused hands and silver dust permanently embedded in their hair. Eastern businessmen in expensive suits trying to stake claims through legal manipulation rather than physical labor. dance hall girls looking for work in establishments that promised better pay than factory jobs back east, con artists running elaborate schemes that separated fools from their money, and families hoping to build new lives in the thin mountain air where anything seemed possible. Among this chaotic mix were Catherine and Margaret McKenna, two sisters in their late 20s who had arrived from Boston in the spring of 1879 with little more than their life savings sewn into their dresses and a determination to establish themselves in the growing town. Their arrival had been noted by several residents, not because there was anything particularly unusual about two women traveling together, but because they seemed so remarkably composed and confident in a place that intimidated even experienced frontiersmen. Catherine, the elder of the two at 31, was a striking woman with auburn hair that caught fire in lamplight and green eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and calculation in equal measure, as if she was always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone around her. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, unusual for a woman of that era, and carried herself with a confidence that commanded respect from the rough men who dominated Leadville society. She had a gift for conversation, able to make any patron feel like the most interesting person in the room, whether he was a grizzled prospector who hadn't bathed in months, or a well-dressed merchant who owned half the businesses in town. Catherine's ability to remember personal details was legendary. She could recall the names of a customer's children, ask about a sick relative, or reference a business deal mentioned weeks earlier in casual conversation. This remarkable memory made people feel valued and understood, creating a sense of personal connection that went far beyond the usual relationship between a saloon keeper and her customers. Men who had never felt listened to in their lives found themselves sharing their deepest hopes and fears with Catherine McKenna, never suspecting that every word was being carefully catalogued for potential future use. Margaret, 28 and quieter than her sister, possessed an almost maternal quality that put people at ease in ways that Catherine's intensity could not. She had soft brown hair that she wore in a simple bun, gentle brown eyes, and a voice so soothing that grown men would find themselves relaxing despite the violence and chaos that surrounded them daily. Newcomers to Leadville often remarked how refreshing it was to find such a kind, refined woman in such a rough place, someone who seemed to represent the civilizing influence that families hoped would eventually tame the wild frontier. Where Catherine was the face of their operation, charming customers and gathering information, Margaret was the practical heart. She managed the financial aspects of their business, kept meticulous records, and handled the day-to-day operations that kept their establishment running smoothly. She was also the one who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of people's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, able to identify within minutes of conversation whether someone was truly alone in the world, or had family who would come looking if they disappeared. The McKenna sisters' saloon occupied a prime corner lot on Harrison Avenue, in a 2-story wooden building they had purchased and renovated with what they claimed was money saved from years of working in Boston's textile mills. The building itself was remarkable for its construction. Solid timber brought up from Denver, real glass windows instead of the oiled paper that many establishments used, and a foundation of carefully fitted stones that spoke of permanence in a town where most buildings seemed designed to be temporary. The ground floor served as the saloon proper, with a long mahogany bar imported from Denver at considerable expense. Round tables made from local pine but finished with a craftsmanship that rivaled furniture from back east, and a small stage where traveling musicians occasionally performed for audiences that might include millionaire mine owners and penniless prospectors sitting side by side. The walls were decorated with paintings of Irish countryside scenes that Catherine claimed reminded her of their homeland, though no one in Leadville had ever heard the sisters speak with Irish accents. The second floor, the sisters explained to curious neighbors, contained their private living quarters and a few rooms they rented out to respectable working girls who needed temporary lodging while they established themselves in Leadville. This arrangement was presented as a charitable service, helping decent young women avoid the dangerous and disreputable boarding houses that catered to prostitutes and dance hall girls. The sisters charged modest rents and insisted on references and evidence of moral character, creating the impression that they were running a kind of sanctuary for virtuous women in a town where virtue was often seen as a luxury few could afford. What set the McKenna establishment apart from the dozens of other saloons in Leadville wasn't just the quality of their whiskey or the cleanliness of their glasses. Though both were noted by customers who had grown accustomed to establishments where the floors were sticky with spilled drinks and tobacco juice. It was their reputation for helping young women find employment that made them unique in a community where female newcomers were usually viewed with suspicion or seen only as potential sources of entertainment. Word had spread throughout the mining camps and neighboring towns that the McKenna sisters were different from other saloon owners. They were known to offer jobs to women who had fallen on hard times, providing room and board while these women learned to serve drinks, keep books, or handle other aspects of running a business. Local church leaders praised them as an example of Christian charity in action, and even the town's newspaper, the Leadville Herald-Democrat, had run a favorable article about their civilizing influence on the community, describing them as two angels of mercy in a land that too often knows only the harsh realities of frontier life. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came not from Leadville itself, but from a desperate letter that arrived at the town marshal's office on a frigid morning in November 1880. The envelope was water-stained and travel-worn, bearing a San Francisco postmark and addressed in handwriting that trembled with either cold or fear. Inside, Marshal William Duggan found 8 pages of cramped writing that told a story so disturbing he would read it 3 times before believing it was real. The letter was from a young woman named Emma Kowalski, who claimed she had escaped from a brothel in the Barbary Coast district and was trying to find her younger sister, Anna. The desperation in Emma's words was palpable. She wrote as someone who had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other and was driven by a combination of love, guilt, and the kind of rage that comes from having everything innocent stripped away. Emma's letter told a harrowing story that began with tragedy and ended with a horror she was still struggling to comprehend. She and Anna had been traveling west from Chicago after their parents died in a tenement fire that had swept through their neighborhood, killing 17 people and leaving dozens of families homeless. The sisters had been working in a hat factory, saving every penny they could spare, when the fire took not only their parents, but also their small apartment and every possession they owned, except the clothes on their backs. With nothing left in Chicago but memories and graves they couldn't afford to visit, the sisters had decided to head west, like thousands of other desperate people seeking new opportunities in the territories. They had heard stories of mining towns where a woman could earn decent wages cooking, cleaning, or working in respectable establishments, and where the shortage of families meant that moral, hard-working women were valued and protected by communities hungry for stability. Their journey had been difficult from the start. What little money they had managed to save before the fire was quickly depleted by train fare, food, and basic necessities. By the time they reached Denver, they were down to their last few dollars and facing the terrifying prospect of being stranded in a strange city with winter approaching. It was in Denver that they first heard about the McKenna sisters from other travelers, how these kind Irish women in Leadville were known for helping young women find respectable employment, providing temporary housing and assistance until suitable positions could be located. The sisters had arrived in Leadville on a September evening in 1880, exhausted from the final leg of their journey on a supply wagon that had jolted and bounced over mountain roads for 2 days. They were dirty, frightened, and carrying everything they owned in a single carpet bag that had belonged to their mother. Emma described in her letter how grateful they had been when Catherine and Margaret welcomed them with hot soup, clean beds, and gentle words of encouragement about their prospects in the growing town. According to Emma's detailed account, the sisters had been nothing but kind for the first few days. They provided meals that were the best food Emma and Anna had tasted since leaving Chicago, clean clothes to replace their travel-stained dresses, and gentle advice about life in the West. Catherine had spent hours talking with them about their background, their skills, and their hopes for the future, showing what seemed like genuine interest in helping them succeed. Catherine had explained that there were many opportunities for intelligent young women in the growing cities of Colorado and California, not just in saloons, but in hotels, restaurants, and even private homes of wealthy families who needed housekeepers, companions, or governesses for their children. She spoke of a network of business associates throughout the West who were always looking for trustworthy girls to fill positions that paid well and provided security that was difficult to find in the uncertain world of frontier life. Emma's account of what happened next would chill even the most hardened lawmen who had thought they had seen every kind of human cruelty in their years of frontier justice. She wrote that after a week of this kind treatment, Margaret had prepared a special dinner to celebrate the sisters' decision to help them find positions in California, where the opportunities were said to be even better than in Colorado. The meal had been delicious: roast beef with potatoes and vegetables, fresh bread, and even a small cake that Margaret had baked specially for the occasion. Emma remembered feeling unusually drowsy during the meal, struggling to keep her eyes open even though it was still early evening. She had attributed it to exhaustion from their long journey and the relief of finally finding people who seemed genuinely interested in helping them. Anna had complained of feeling similarly tired, and Margaret had suggested they go to sleep early to prepare for the journey to their new positions, which would begin the following morning. When Emma awoke, she was in a wagon bouncing along a mountain road, her hands bound with rope, her head pounding from what she now realized had been laudanum mixed into her food. The world seemed to spin around her, and every jolt of the wagon sent waves of nausea through her already confused senses. Anna was beside her, still unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow in a way that terrified Emma even more than their obvious captivity. In the front of the wagon sat a man Emma had never seen before, a tall, bearded figure who spoke with a Spanish accent and seemed to know Catherine McKenna well enough to joke with her about the merchandise he was transporting. When Emma demanded to know where they were being taken, fighting against the ropes and the lingering effects of the drugs, the man had laughed and explained in crude terms that she and her sister had been purchased by some businessmen in California who needed workers for their establishments. He made it clear that resistance would be met with violence, and that the McKenna sisters had already received their payment for delivering 2 healthy young women to their new employers. The casual way he discussed their fate, as if they were livestock being transported to market, was almost as horrifying as the reality of their situation. Emma realized that to these people, she and Anna were not human beings with hopes and dreams, but simply commodities to be bought and sold like bags of flour or mining equipment. The journey to California had taken weeks, with Emma and Anna moved from wagon to train to ship, always under guard, always drugged when they showed signs of causing trouble or trying to escape. Emma's letter described the horror of realizing that dozens of other girls were being transported along the same route, all of them having trusted the wrong people in their desperate search for a new life in the West. Some had been recruited by the McKenna sisters, others by similar operations in different towns, but all were bound for the same fate: forced prostitution in the brothels and cribs of San Francisco's most dangerous district. The women came from everywhere. Farm girls from Kansas whose families had lost their land to drought, factory workers from eastern cities who had lost their jobs to economic downturns, immigrants who had arrived in America with nothing but hope and had quickly learned that the promised land could be as cruel as the countries they had fled. What they all had in common was desperation, isolation, and the terrible misfortune of trusting people who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity for profit. Emma had managed to escape only after months of captivity when a fire broke out in the building where she was being held, and she had slipped away in the confusion of firefighters and fleeing customers. She had spent weeks hiding in alleys and abandoned buildings, working odd jobs for pennies to earn enough money for passage back east, all the while haunted by the knowledge that Anna was still trapped somewhere in that nightmare world of violence and exploitation. Her letter to the Leadville marshal was a desperate plea. Please investigate the McKenna sisters, find Anna, and prevent other girls from suffering the same fate that had destroyed so many lives and dreams in the name of profit and cruelty. Marshal William Duggan was a veteran lawman who had seen his share of violence and corruption in mining towns throughout Colorado. But Emma's letter disturbed him in a way that few things had during his 15 years of frontier law enforcement. He had known the McKenna sisters personally. Catherine had served him drinks at town meetings, always remembering how he liked his whiskey and asking intelligent questions about local politics. Margaret had always asked after his wife's health with what seemed like genuine concern, and had even sent over a pot of soup when Sarah Duggan had been bedridden with pneumonia the previous winter. The idea that these respectable women could be involved in such a heinous crime seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet Emma's letter contained details about the sisters' saloon, their methods of operation, and their personal mannerisms that only someone who had spent time with them could have known. The specific descriptions of the building's interior, the way Catherine tilted her head when she was thinking, Margaret's habit of humming while she worked. These were details that couldn't have been invented or learned secondhand. Duggan decided to begin a quiet investigation, knowing that if he moved too quickly or openly, he might alert the sisters to his suspicions and give them time to cover their tracks or disappear entirely. He started by reviewing the records of young women who had been reported missing in Leadville and the surrounding mining camps over the past year and a half, a task that proved more difficult than he had anticipated because record-keeping in frontier towns was often haphazard and incomplete. What he found made his blood run cold and his hands shake as he turned through page after page of missing person reports. At least 15 different families had filed reports about daughters, sisters, or wives who had disappeared without explanation. The reports painted a consistent pattern. Young women traveling alone or in pairs, often arriving in Leadville with little money and few connections, last seen in the vicinity of establishments that catered to transient workers. In most cases, the women had last been seen near the McKenna sisters' saloon, often having mentioned to friends or family that they were hoping to find work there, or had heard good things about the sisters' willingness to help women in difficult circumstances. What made the pattern even more disturbing was that these disappearances had been spread out over time and had involved women from different backgrounds and circumstances, making it less likely that anyone would notice the connections between cases. Margaret O'Brien, 18 years old, had arrived from Ireland with her cousin in March 1880. The cousin had found work at a boarding house, but Margaret had been told by several people that the McKenna sisters might be able to help her find something more suitable for a girl of her education and refinement. She had been seen entering the McKenna saloon on a Tuesday afternoon and had never emerged. When her cousin inquired the next day, Catherine McKenna had claimed that Margaret had decided to travel to Denver immediately to take a position with a wealthy family, and had left word that she would write once she was settled. Sarah Jenkins, 22, had been traveling with her husband to California when he had been killed in a mining accident near Fairplay. Stranded without money or connections, she had come to Leadville hoping to earn enough to continue her journey west. Multiple witnesses had seen her talking with Margaret McKenna about employment opportunities, and she had been excited about the possibility of work in San Francisco. She had disappeared on the same night she was supposed to meet with someone about a position, taking her few belongings, but leaving behind a letter she had been writing to her sister back in Ohio. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Women in desperate circumstances, attracted by the McKenna sisters' reputation for helping their own gender, disappearing after expressing optimism about employment opportunities that seemed too good to be true. In several cases, the missing women had left behind personal items or unfinished letters that suggested they had expected to return, evidence that their departures had not been voluntary or planned. Local business owners, when questioned discreetly, began to share observations that had seemed innocent at the time, but now took on darker implications. Thomas Brennan, who operated a general store near the McKenna Saloon, recalled seeing young women arrive at the sisters' establishment with small traveling bags, clearly intending to stay temporarily. But he had never seen these same women leave during his normal business hours. When he had asked Catherine about this once, she had explained that many of the girls found work quickly and moved on to other towns before he had a chance to notice their departure, often leaving very early in the morning to catch transportation. Sarah Fleming, who ran a boarding house for respectable women, remembered several instances when desperate young women had come to her seeking lodging, only to be turned away because they couldn't afford her rates or couldn't provide the references she required. She had directed them to the McKenna sisters, thinking she was doing them a kindness by connecting them with people who had a reputation for charitable work. "I thought those women were angels," she told Marshall Duggan years later, her voice breaking with guilt and regret. "I was sending those poor girls straight to hell, and I had no idea what I was doing." Dr. William Patterson, who served as the town's primary physician, recalled being asked to examine several young women who were staying with the McKenna sisters, always for minor ailments that seemed to require his discretion more than his medical expertise. The sisters had always been present during these examinations, and the women themselves had seemed unusually quiet and subdued, answering questions with single words and avoiding eye contact. At the time, he had attributed this behavior to shyness or embarrassment. But looking back, he wondered if the women had been drugged or threatened into compliance. The breakthrough in Marshall Duggan's investigation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Helena Morrison, one of the few female physicians in Colorado, and a woman who had been quietly documenting suspicious activities in Leadville for months. Dr. Morrison had completed her medical training at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, overcoming enormous obstacles to obtain an education that most people believed was unsuitable for women. And she had come to Colorado specifically because she believed frontier communities needed physicians who understood the unique challenges faced by women in the West. Dr. Morrison had established her practice in a small office above Murphy's General Store in early 1880 and had quickly gained the trust of local women who appreciated having someone who understood their medical needs without judgment or embarrassment. She had treated everything from difficult pregnancies to injuries sustained in domestic violence, always maintaining strict confidentiality while building a detailed understanding of the various dangers that women faced in mining communities. In her private journals, which she kept locked in a safe and would later share with authorities, Dr. Morrison had documented several disturbing cases that had left her increasingly concerned about activities in Leadville. Her medical training had taught her to observe symptoms carefully and to look for patterns that might indicate broader health threats to the community, and what she was seeing suggested something far more sinister than the individual tragedies she had initially assumed she was treating. In October 1880, she had treated a young woman named Clara Hoffman, who had stumbled into her office in a state of severe disorientation, barely able to walk straight and speaking in slurred, confused sentences. Clara's symptoms, dilated pupils, slurred speech, profound confusion, and what appeared to be partial memory loss, were consistent with opium or laudanum intoxication. But the girl insisted she had consumed nothing stronger than beer at the McKenna Saloon the previous evening. Clara's story was troubling and filled with gaps that seemed to disturb her as much as they concerned Dr. Morrison. She had arrived in Leadville from Kansas 3 weeks earlier, hoping to find work as a seamstress or housekeeper after her family had lost their farm to drought and debt. Catherine McKenna had befriended her on her second day in town, offering sympathy for her situation and practical advice about finding employment in a community where single women were often viewed with suspicion. The friendship had seemed genuine and beneficial to Clara, who had been struggling with loneliness and fear in a strange place where she knew no one and had very little money. Catherine had offered her a temporary room above the saloon while she searched for permanent employment, charging only a minimal amount for rent and providing meals that were far better than anything Clara could have afforded on her own. On her third night there, Margaret had invited her to join the sisters for a special dinner, claiming they wanted to celebrate Clara's decision to stay in Leadville and make it her permanent home. Clara remembered the meal being delicious and the conversation pleasant, with both sisters sharing stories about their own experiences as women making their way in the world without male protection. She recalled feeling unusually sleepy after dessert and had excused herself to go to her room early, attributing her fatigue to the stress of adjusting to mountain altitude and her uncertain situation. Clara's next clear memory was waking up 12 hours later feeling violently ill, with a headache so severe she could barely open her eyes and nausea that made it impossible to keep down even water. What made the situation even more disturbing was that she seemed to have lost an entire day of her life. She had vague, dream-like memories of being moved and handled, of voices speaking around her, but nothing that made coherent sense or formed a complete narrative. When she had awakened, Clara found that her personal belongings were gone. Not just her small amount of money, but her clothes, letters from family members, and even a small Bible that had belonged to her mother and was her most treasured possession. When she asked Margaret about the missing items, she was told that Clara had been talking in her sleep about leaving town immediately and had apparently packed her bags during the night while in some kind of sleepwalking episode. Margaret suggested that Clara might have been experiencing a kind of nervous breakdown due to stress and exhaustion, a condition she claimed to have seen in other young women struggling to adapt to life in the harsh mountain environment. Dr. Morrison had been immediately suspicious of this explanation, particularly when Clara described the physical sensations she remembered from her lost day, feeling as though she was floating, being unable to control her body movements, and having the strange impression that people were discussing her as if she wasn't present. These were classic symptoms of laudanum intoxication, and the physician had seen similar presentations in patients who had been dosed without their knowledge, often as a prelude to robbery or sexual assault. She had urged Clara to report the incident to Marshal Duggan, but Clara had been reluctant to accuse the McKenna sisters without concrete proof of wrongdoing, especially when they had a reputation for helping women, and she herself was still dependent on community goodwill to survive in Leadville. The fear of being branded a troublemaker or a liar was often enough to keep victims silent, particularly women who already occupied a precarious position in frontier society. 2 weeks later, Dr. Morrison encountered another case that was so similar it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Rebecca Tanner, a 19-year-old from Illinois, had been brought to her office by a concerned friend who had found her wandering the streets of Leadville at dawn, wearing only her nightgown and shoes, confused and unable to remember how she had gotten there or where she had spent the night. Rebecca's last clear memory was of having dinner with the McKenna sisters, who had promised to introduce her to a family in Denver that needed a governess for their children. The position sounded perfect for Rebecca, who had completed 2 years of education at a seminary school before her family's financial situation had forced her to seek employment. She had been excited about the opportunity and grateful to the sisters for thinking of her when they heard about the opening. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed the same symptoms she had seen in Clara: evidence of laudanum intoxication, confusion about recent events, and a profound sense that something terrible had happened to her, even though she couldn't remember what. Unlike Clara, however, Rebecca had awakened in a strange room that wasn't part of the McKenna saloon, with bruises on her wrists and ankles that suggested she had been restrained, and marks on her arms that looked like rope burns. Most disturbing of all, Rebecca had only managed to escape when she had awakened briefly during what appeared to be transportation. She remembered being in the back of a covered wagon with several other people, feeling sick and disoriented, but aware enough to realize she was in danger. When the wagon had stopped for what seemed like a rest break, she had managed to throw herself out and hide in the woods until her captors gave up searching for her and continued on their way without her. By January 1881, Marshal Duggan had gathered enough evidence to justify a more aggressive investigation. But he faced a significant problem that illustrated the complex social dynamics of frontier communities. The McKenna sisters were not just respected members of the community. They had become integral to Leadville's vision of itself as a civilized place where decent people could build better lives than what they had left behind in the East. Catherine had cultivated relationships with several prominent businessmen in Leadville, including Horace Tabor himself, the silver magnate whose wealth and influence dominated much of Colorado's political and economic landscape. She had impressed these men with her intelligence and business acumen, and they often cited the McKenna sisters as examples of the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that was making the West prosper. Margaret's charitable work with local churches had earned her the support of religious leaders who would be reluctant to believe accusations against a woman they considered a model of Christian virtue. The sisters had also been careful to establish financial connections that made them valuable to other business owners. They purchased supplies from local merchants, hired local workers for construction and maintenance projects, and had even provided loans to struggling business owners during difficult periods. Their saloon generated tax revenue for the town and provided employment for several people, making them economically important to a community that was always concerned about maintaining its growth and prosperity. Duggan knew that if he moved against the sisters without overwhelming evidence, they could easily claim persecution and rally community support to their cause. Influential people would question his motives, suggest that he was targeting successful women out of jealousy or prejudice, and demand proof that went far beyond what was normally required for criminal investigations involving men. The standards of evidence were always higher when accusations were made against people who had established reputations and social connections. He also suspected that if they sensed they were under investigation, they would simply disappear, taking their secrets with them and leaving their victims without justice. The West was vast, and transportation was improving rapidly, making it easy for people to reinvent themselves in new communities where their pasts would never be discovered. The marshal needed to catch them in the act, but doing so required patience and careful planning that felt like torture when he thought about other potential victims who might be suffering while he gathered evidence. The breakthrough came from a source that no one could have predicted. Anna Kowalski, Emma's sister, who had managed to escape from captivity in San Francisco and had made her way back to Colorado, seeking the kind of justice that the legal system seemed unable or unwilling to provide. Anna's journey back to Leadville was a harrowing story in itself that demonstrated the incredible determination and strength that some people discover when pushed beyond what should be the limits of human endurance. Anna had endured months of forced prostitution in a Barbary Coast brothel, a nightmare world where violence was routine and escape seemed impossible. The brothel operated in a 3-story building that housed nearly 40 women, all of them controlled through a combination of drugs, violence, and psychological manipulation that was designed to break their spirits and make them compliant. The women were kept in debt bondage, told that they owed enormous sums for their transportation, room and board, and that they would never be allowed to leave until these debts were paid off, which, through creative accounting, never happened. Anna's escape had come during a police raid that had been intended to arrest customers rather than rescue victims, part of San Francisco's periodic attempts to appear concerned about vice while actually maintaining the profitable status quo. In the confusion of the raid, with customers fleeing and police officers focused on making arrests for public relations purposes, Anna had managed to slip out a back window and disappear into the maze of streets and alleys that made up the Barbary Coast. Her journey back to Colorado had taken months of hiding, working odd jobs for subsistence wages, and slowly saving enough money for transportation. She had worked as a dishwasher in restaurant kitchens, cleaned floors in office buildings, and done any other work that would hire a woman with no references and no questions asked. The physical hardships of this journey were nothing compared to the psychological challenge of maintaining her sanity and her sense of purpose when everything she had once believed about justice and human decency had been shattered by her experiences. Anna's appearance in Leadville in February 1881 was shocking to those who had known her as a sweet, naive girl just 18 months earlier. The trauma of her experiences had transformed her into a hardened young woman with eyes that had seen too much and a burning desire for revenge that had become the only thing keeping her alive. Unlike her sister Emma, who had chosen to flee as far from the West as possible and try to forget what had happened, Anna had decided to return and ensure that the McKenna sisters paid for their crimes, regardless of the personal cost. Anna's testimony provided Marshal Duggan with detailed information about the trafficking network's operations that went far beyond anything he had previously understood. She described how victims were transported from Leadville to Denver, then to Salt Lake City, and finally to San Francisco, moving along established routes that avoided major law enforcement presence and utilized safe houses where travelers could be hidden if pursuit seemed likely. The network included corrupt officials who were paid to look the other way, legitimate businesses that served as fronts for moving victims, and a communication system that allowed coordinators to track shipments and payments across hundreds of miles. She knew the names of several other women who had been trafficked by the McKenna sisters, could provide physical descriptions of the men who served as transporters and guards for the criminal organization, and most importantly, could describe the methods used to identify and recruit potential victims. The sisters had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed them to quickly identify women who were isolated, desperate, and unlikely to be missed if they disappeared. Most importantly, Anna revealed that the McKenna sisters kept detailed records of their transactions. Each woman they trafficked was documented with information about her background, physical characteristics, and the price paid for her delivery. These records were kept in a locked cabinet in Margaret's private room, along with personal items taken from victims that served as trophies or evidence of successful transactions. The business-like nature of these records was perhaps more chilling than the crimes themselves, representing a level of systematic dehumanization that turned individual tragedies into accounting entries. Anna also provided disturbing details about the methods used to break the spirits of trafficked women once they reached their destinations. The process began with drugging and kidnapping, but continued with systematic psychological abuse designed to make victims compliant and hopeless. Women were told that their families had been informed they had died in accidents, that law enforcement was looking for them as criminals who had fled to avoid prosecution, and that their only choice was to accept their new circumstances and try to make the best of an impossible situation. Those who resisted were subjected to violence that was calculated to terrify without permanently damaging the merchandise. Women were beaten in ways that left bruises in places that wouldn't show, threatened with harm to family members back home, and forced to witness the punishment of others as a warning about what would happen if they continued to cause trouble. The sophistication of the operation was remarkable for its time period. The criminal network had established safe houses along transportation routes, corrupt officials who looked the other way in exchange for regular payments, and even legitimate businesses that served as fronts for moving victims without attracting suspicion. The McKenna sisters were just one link in a chain that stretched from small farming communities to major urban centers, feeding the voracious demand for young women in the West's booming cities, where men outnumbered women by ratios that sometimes exceeded 10-1. Anna's return to Leadville created a dangerous situation for everyone involved. She was determined to confront the McKenna sisters directly, believing that public exposure would be more satisfying than quiet legal proceedings that might be influenced by the sisters' social connections and financial resources. Marshal Duggan was equally determined to prevent Anna from taking matters into her own hands, both because he wanted to gather more evidence and because he feared Anna might be walking into a trap that could cost her life. If the McKenna sisters realized their former victim had returned to town, they might take drastic action to protect themselves, either by eliminating Anna as a witness or by accelerating their own plans to disappear before they could be arrested. The marshal found himself walking a tightrope between justice and vengeance, trying to build a legal case while preventing a young woman who had already suffered too much from destroying herself in pursuit of revenge. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the full extent of the McKenna sisters' crimes, Anna's return brought new revelations that would shock even the most hardened investigators. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next as this tale of deception and survival reaches its most dangerous point. The tension in Leadville was palpable as word began to spread that something was happening involving the McKenna sisters. Anna's presence in town couldn't be kept secret for long, and several people who had known her before her disappearance began to ask questions about where she had been and why she looked so different. The sisters themselves seemed to sense that their situation was becoming precarious, and their behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways that suggested they were preparing for some kind of confrontation. Catherine had always been careful about her social interactions, but she became even more guarded, declining invitations to community events and avoiding conversations that might reveal too much about her activities. Margaret, who had always been the more nervous of the two, began showing signs of severe stress. She was seen pacing at odd hours, and several customers noted that her hands shook when she served drinks. The women who worked at their saloon reported that the sisters had become demanding and suspicious, questioning them about conversations they had with customers and insisting on knowing every detail of their daily activities. The final confrontation came on a bitter cold night in March 1881, when everything that had been building for months finally exploded into the open with a violence that would be remembered in Leadville for generations. Anna Kowalski, despite Marshal Duggan's warnings and his attempts to keep her under protective surveillance, had decided to take matters into her own hands. She had spent weeks watching the McKenna saloon, learning the sisters' routines, and waiting for the right moment to strike back at the people who had destroyed her life and the lives of so many other innocent women. That moment came when Anna observed the arrival of another young victim, a girl of perhaps 17 who had clearly traveled a long distance and appeared desperate for shelter and assistance. The girl had the same look that Anna remembered seeing in mirrors during her first days in Leadville. Hope mixed with fear, determination tempered by exhaustion, and the kind of trusting innocence that predators could spot from across a crowded street. Anna watched as Catherine McKenna welcomed the girl with her characteristic warmth, offering food and a place to rest, asking gentle questions about her journey and her plans, expressing sympathy for her difficulties and optimism about her prospects in Leadville. It was the same performance Anna had witnessed 18 months earlier, and the sight of another innocent victim walking into the same trap that had destroyed her own life was more than Anna could bear. The decision to act was made in that moment, driven by a combination of rage, guilt, and the desperate hope that she could save at least one person from the fate she had endured. Anna entered the McKenna saloon that evening, armed with a Derringer pistol she had purchased in Denver, carrying a leather satchel containing evidence of the sisters' crimes, letters, photographs, and documents she had gathered during her months of captivity in San Francisco, as well as testimonies from other victims she had met along the way. Her plan was simple but desperate. She would confront Catherine and Margaret publicly, present her evidence, and demand that they confess their crimes in front of witnesses who could no longer claim ignorance about what was happening in their community. She believed that public shame and exposure would be more devastating than any legal punishment, and that forcing the truth into the open would prevent other women from becoming victims. What Anna hadn't anticipated was that the McKenna sisters had been expecting something like this to happen for weeks. They had noticed increased attention from law enforcement, heard rumors that former victims were asking questions, and had been making preparations to abandon their Leadville operation and disappear before they could be arrested. When Anna walked into their saloon that March evening, they were ready for her, and the confrontation that followed would prove that they were far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The evening began quietly, with Anna approaching the bar and asking to speak privately with both sisters. Catherine, recognizing Anna despite the dramatic changes in her appearance, maintained her composure and agreed to the conversation, but she subtly signaled to Margaret, who slipped away to alert their associates. Within minutes, 3 armed men had positioned themselves strategically around the saloon, men who Anna recognized as some of the same transporters who had moved her and other victims along the trafficking route. Anna's accusations were devastating and specific, delivered with a cold fury that silenced the normal evening chatter of the saloon's customers. She named dates, described transportation routes, and provided details about the criminal network that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. She spoke about the other women she had known in San Francisco who had been trafficked by the McKenna sisters, some of whom had died from violence or disease in the brothels, others who had simply disappeared when they became too sick or troublesome to be profitable. She demanded that Catherine and Margaret acknowledge their crimes and surrender themselves to authorities. But more than that, she wanted them to explain how they had been able to live with themselves, how they had been able to smile and offer comfort to desperate women while planning their destruction. The psychological cruelty of the deception seemed to disturb Anna even more than the physical violence that had followed. Catherine's response revealed the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath her charming exterior, but also the arrogance of someone who had operated without consequences for too long. She denied nothing, but instead of showing remorse, she expressed a kind of twisted admiration for Anna's survival and return to Leadville. She explained that the trafficking operation had been nothing personal, simply a business opportunity that had proven profitable in a frontier economy where demand for certain services far exceeded supply. Young women were a commodity, she argued, and she and Margaret had simply been efficient in moving that commodity to where it was in highest demand. She spoke about their victims with the same casual indifference that a cattle trader might use to describe livestock, reducing human lives to market transactions that required no more moral consideration than any other business dealing. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Duggan and his deputies, who had been monitoring the saloon and had seen the armed men entering the building. The marshal had realized that Anna was planning something dangerous and had positioned his men nearby, hoping to prevent violence while still allowing her confrontation with the sisters to proceed. What followed was a chaotic gunfight that lasted only minutes but seemed to stretch on forever in the confined space of the saloon. Two of the sisters' associates were killed in the initial exchange of gunfire, their bodies falling behind overturned tables where they had taken cover. Anna was seriously wounded when one of the men shot her in the shoulder before being cut down by Deputy Marshal James Crawford, who had been positioned near the saloon's rear entrance. In the confusion of smoke, gunfire, and screaming customers, Margaret McKenna was shot and killed by Deputy Thomas Riley, who mistook her for one of the armed criminals when she reached for what appeared to be a weapon, but was actually the key to the cabinet where the sisters kept their records. Catherine McKenna managed to escape through a rear exit during the chaos, disappearing into the network of alleys and back streets that she had clearly mapped out for just such an emergency. Despite immediate pursuit by law enforcement and a town-wide search that continued for days, she seemed to vanish completely into the vast wilderness of the American West, taking with her the secrets that might have led to the arrest of other members of the trafficking network. The search for Catherine McKenna lasted for weeks, with law enforcement agencies throughout Colorado and neighboring states joining the effort. Wanted posters were distributed from Denver to San Francisco, offering substantial rewards for information leading to her capture. She had clearly had escape plans prepared well in advance, with money hidden in various locations and safe houses established along potential flight routes. Some witnesses claimed to have seen her in Denver, others in Salt Lake City. But none of these sightings could be confirmed, and Catherine McKenna effectively disappeared from recorded history. The investigation of the McKenna Saloon yielded evidence that exceeded even Marshal Duggan's worst expectations, and provided a glimpse into criminal enterprise that was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Hidden beneath the floorboards were not only the clothing and personal effects of trafficked women, but also detailed business records, correspondence with criminal associates throughout the West, and maps showing transportation routes that connected dozens of communities across multiple states and territories. The documents revealed that the McKenna operation had trafficked at least 47 young women over a period of 2 years, generating profits that exceeded $15,000, an enormous sum for the time period that represented more money than most legitimate businesses in Leadville earned in several years of operation. The records showed payments to corrupt officials, expenses for transportation and safe houses, and even what appeared to be insurance payments to compensate for merchandise that was damaged or lost during transport. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of a collection of photographs that Margaret McKenna had apparently taken of their victims. These images, found in her private room along with detailed written descriptions, showed dozens of young women in various states of unconsciousness or distress, apparently documenting the sisters' success in capturing and subduing their targets. The photographs served no practical business purpose. They appeared to be trophies that Margaret had kept for her own psychological satisfaction, evidence of a level of cruelty that went beyond simple criminal profit. The aftermath of the McKenna case sent shockwaves through Leadville and the broader Colorado Territory, forcing communities throughout the region to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew their neighbors and how easily evil could disguise itself behind a facade of respectability. The investigation revealed that the sisters' criminal network had extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, with connections to similar operations in at least 6 other states and territories. Federal authorities became involved, leading to arrests in Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco that ultimately dismantled much of the trafficking network that had been operating throughout the West. The investigation revealed a level of criminal organization that challenged assumptions about frontier lawlessness. Rather than random violence and individual crimes, the McKenna case exposed sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated across state lines with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. Anna Kowalski survived her wounds, but was forever changed by her experiences and her quest for justice. The confrontation with the McKenna sisters had given her a sense of closure, but it had also cost her physically and emotionally in ways that would affect her for the rest of her life. She became one of the first advocates for legislation to combat human trafficking, testifying before territorial and federal lawmakers about the need for stronger penalties and better protection for victims. Her testimony helped lead to new laws that increased penalties for kidnapping and made it easier for law enforcement agencies to cooperate across state lines in pursuing traffickers. Anna's courage in speaking publicly about her experiences, despite the social stigma that still attached to victims of sexual violence, helped other survivors find their voices and seek justice for crimes that had previously been ignored or dismissed by authorities. Dr. Helena Morrison's medical documentation proved crucial in prosecuting other members of the criminal network, providing evidence that helped convict several men who had served as transporters and guards. Her careful records of laudanum poisoning cases created a medical foundation for understanding how the trafficking operation had functioned, and her willingness to testify in court helped establish the credibility of victim testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed. Dr. Morrison continued her medical practice in Leadville and became a vocal advocate for women's safety and healthcare throughout the frontier regions. She established protocols for recognizing and treating victims of trafficking and worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better procedures for investigating cases involving violence against women. Marshal William Dugan was promoted to U.S. Marshal and spent much of his remaining career tracking down other members of trafficking networks throughout the West. He never stopped looking for Catherine McKenna, following leads and investigating rumors for more than a decade. Some evidence suggested that she had fled to Mexico, while other reports placed her in various western cities operating under assumed names, but she was never definitively located or brought to justice. The case had broader implications for how Western communities viewed the protection of vulnerable women and the identification of criminal enterprises that preyed on desperate people seeking better lives. Church organizations began establishing more formal networks to assist female travelers, and law enforcement agencies developed better procedures for investigating missing persons cases that involved women traveling alone. The McKenna case demonstrated that the frontier's reputation for lawlessness had created opportunities for sophisticated criminal enterprises that preyed on the very people seeking new opportunities in the American West. It also showed how criminals had exploited society's expectations about women's roles and behavior, using their gender and their reputation for charitable work as camouflage for activities that represented some of the most heinous crimes of their era. Most importantly, The investigation revealed how easily evil can hide behind a facade of respectability, and how the most trusted members of a community can sometimes be the ones harboring the darkest secrets. The McKenna sisters were able to operate for years, not because they were particularly clever criminals, but because they understood how to exploit people's assumptions and expectations, turning the very virtues of frontier hospitality and community support into weapons against the innocent. This mystery shows us how easily evil can hide behind a facade of respectability, and how the most trusted members of a community can sometimes be the ones harboring the darkest secrets. The McKenna sisters were able to operate for years, not because they were particularly clever criminals, but because they understood how to exploit people's assumptions and expectations. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or might there still be secrets buried in those Colorado mountains? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.